What's up, guys? This is Greg. Welcome back to my channel. I'm here to talk to you guys about the second coming of Christ. More specifically, I'm here to help inform you guys on the nature of his coming, whether he has already come or whether he's about to come. And so if you're interested in hearing more about that topic, I suggest that you stick around because I'm going to break it down to you. So without further ado, let me go right into this topic. And let me begin by saying that this falls under the topic of eschatology. Now, the prefix in the word eschatology is the Greek word eschatos, and it is the Greek word for last things or end times. So when we speak of eschatology, we're speaking of the study of the last things or the study of end times. Now, let me first preface by saying this. When we speak of the last things or the end times, we must first clarify what exactly we are referring to when we say that it is the last days. People don't often clarify that, but without substantiating the claim, without going into the justification for my claim, suffice it to say that the last days were the last days of not the entire world. Now, if you're reading the King James Version Bible, your translation will use the word world, but in the Greek, it's not the word cosmos, but it's the word aeon. Now, the word aeon in Greek, when translated, is more accurately and properly translated as age. So when the disciples in Matthew 24 asked about when will be the signs of his coming and the end of the age and the destruction of the temple, he says this in Matthew 24 when Jesus was referencing the destruction of the temple and when one stone will not be left upon another. He prophesied about this and gave us indications and descriptions in that specific catalog with regards to when the apostles could be informed about when it was around the corner. Okay, so there's three things there that they asked: when will be the destruction of the temple, when will be the sign of his coming, and when will be the end of the age. It's all packaged together. So when we speak of the end of the age, we must understand that according to the Jew, there was two ages: the Mosaic age and what would later be known as the eternal age of the Messiah. Okay, this is why Jesus, and a lot of people think that the second age is the age of our eternal being in heaven, but the only problem with that is Jesus makes reference to the age to come, and he says it this way. I can't tell you the exact chapter or verse on top of my head, but he says this: he who blasphemes against the Son of Man can be forgiven, but he who blasphemes against the Spirit shall not be forgiven in this age, nor the age to come. Okay, so that at least suggests to us that sinning in the age to come is possible. Now, if the age to come was in heaven, then how exactly could we sin in heaven? You got to think about those things. Obviously, there is no sin in heaven, so this age that Jesus was referencing that he said was to come was the end. Was the age, the eternal age, the consummation of the age of the Messiah. Now, I don't have time to unpack when that exactly was, but let me just say here that it wasn't necessarily at the time of his death, resurrection, or ascension. See, the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, that the bringing in of the new covenant, he made the first one obsolete, but that which is obsolete and outdated is ready to vanish away. So although at the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the first covenant was made obsolete, it had not yet disappeared. It was not yet, it did not yet vanish away. Now, with all that said, when we speak of the last things or the end times, we're speaking of the last days of the old Mosaic age. Not the end of the world, the end of the aeon. If you look in the Greek and you do a careful analysis in Matthew chapter 24, you will take note of the fact that the apostles asked Jesus when will be the sign of his coming and the end of the age. Now, with all that said, let us go to Matthew chapter 24, and I want to show you guys something. I don't have time to unpack everything there in the text because I want to make this video as brief as possible. Nevertheless, let me just quickly break down to you a number of things that are listed in Matthew 24, because undoubtedly Matthew 24 speaks of the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, there's a great tribulation that's mentioned. There are earthquakes and famines, wars and rumors of wars. There are birth pains. There's persecution. There's the great tribulation. And there would be the destruction of the temple. And there will be the preaching of the gospel as a witness to all the earth. And finally, the end will come, which was then consummated by the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and the coming of the Son of Man. Now, I want to point out to you this thing that many years ago, when I was a younger believer, often stuck out to me. It was a problem to me, and exegetically, I could not resolve this issue. And the funny thing is, oftentimes, even scholars and commentators try to finagle their way and bend over backwards and do gymnastics, theological and eschatological gymnastics, and play origami with the scriptures to try to evade this problem. And the problem is this. Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you," now notice this is in the chapter, this is in the very context of the end of the age, the coming of the Son of Man, the great tribulation, the appearing of the Antichrist, all of these things are mentioned. So when we come to verse 34, do a careful analysis, contextual analysis for yourself to see that this is in fact the case. This is what Jesus says. Truly, we have to acknowledge that in verse 34, Jesus says, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away. Now, let me read it first. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Okay. Number one, what generation was he referring to? Is he speaking about the 21st century? Is he speaking about people in 21st century America? No. What we have to recognize is the Bible was written to them, but for us. This letter was not written to me. It's not written to you. Therefore, it's not referring to you. It's referring to them. So when Jesus is speaking to his apostles, he's saying to them, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have happened. Well, all things are all things. So a lot of people try to finagle out of this and say, well, technically a generation can mean yada, yada, yada. But the reality is, no, it can't. The Bible clarifies in Exodus and as well as in Psalms how long a generation is. The Bible says that God was angry with that generation for 40 years. Okay, so we learn that it was within a 40-year span that they had in order for the fulfillment of all things. Okay, so, but secondly, Jesus said that all things would be fulfilled, not some of them, not the majority of them, all of them. And guess what? Well, answer this question. What are all things there? Secondly, does the second coming, does Jesus include the second coming? Does he assume the second coming within the all things there in verse 34? Yes, he does. So that means that the second coming of Jesus Christ would have occurred in that generation. Now, this was said when Jesus was about 32, maybe possibly 33 years of age. Now, the coming of Christ occurred in 70 AD. So that means that Jesus' prophecy was accurate when he said that this generation will not pass away until until all of these things have taken place. So that means that all of the things have taken place. You do the math from 32, maybe 33 AD to 70 AD. It was just a few years shy of the passing of that generation. Okay, now here's a number of other passages that I want to read to you. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. When they persecute you, referring to the apostles, in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, not to those who believe on me after you, but to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Wow. So either the Son of Man already came, or people are still, there's still people that need to hear the gospel in Israel. There's still one man hanging in the tree, or in the tribe somewhere, isolated from the rest of society as a hermit, and no one has preached to him yet. No, that's not what it's referring to. Jesus said what he meant, that the apostles would not have gone through all of Israel until the coming of the Son of Man. So now if Jesus didn't come back, that means, wait, hold on. It's taken over 2,000 years to evangelize Israel? No. I want to read this also. Matthew chapter 16, verse 28. Jesus said this, "Truly I tell you," referring to the apostles, "some of you are standing here, will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now, undoubtedly, we know that the coming in his kingdom is the coming on the clouds. So either the apostles are still alive today, or Jesus came before they tasted death. Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus says to the high priest, now Jesus is responding to the high priest when the high priest asked him, "If you're the Christ," he says, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." By the way, the high priest that was questioning Jesus was the Antichrist, because he was the one, according to Thessalonians, that had his right to take his seat in the temple of God, standing in the holy place. Who had authority to stand in the holy place? The priest did. What was the holy place? Well, if we read the Old Testament, we learn that the holy place was the temple. Well, guess what? The temple ain't standing today. That's right, it's not, because it was destroyed in 70 A.D. And the high priest who took his seat in the temple, seen the Son of Man come out of the clouds with great glory and power. Now, I want to close with this, because I don't want to say too much, because there's so much more that can be said, and this is by no means an exhaustive teaching. This is merely scratching the surface. But I want to read for you what Josephus said in the 1st century. He's a Jewish historian employed by the Roman Empire who had taken account of these things. Mind, 1st century. So this was in his lifetime. Look at what he had to say about this. "Prodigies had occurred, which this nation, prone to superstition, but hating all religious rites, did not deem it lawful to expiate by offering and sacrifice. There had been seen hosts joining battle in the skies." He's referring to angels. "The fiery gleam of arms, the temple illuminated by a sudden radiance from the clouds. The doors of the inner shrine were suddenly thrown open, and a voice of more than mortal tone was heard to cry that the gods were departing." What did the Bible say in Thessalonians? That when the Antichrist takes a seat in the temple, and there will be a voice of the archangel, a trumpet of God. So they heard a loud voice. And it says that the gods were departing. At the same instant, there was a mighty stir as of departure. Some few put a fearful meaning on these events, but in most there was a firm persuasion that in the ancient records of their priests was contained a prediction of how at this very time the East was to grow powerful, and rulers coming from Judea were to acquire universal empire. So actually, this wasn't Josephus, this was Tacitus. However, Josephus also records the same event, that there were chariots and angels seen in the clouds. Now, those at that time understood that the, quote, acquire of universal empire was none other than the consummation of the kingdom of the Christ. This is Psalm 110. This is Psalm 2, right? That he shall receive the nations as his inheritance. On the day of his wrath, he shall dash the rulers with the rod of iron. Now, the interesting thing is this, that he did in fact dash the Jews, 1 million of them, the Pharisees, the high priest, all of them with a rod of iron, through the Roman Empire. You know, I believe it's in Isaiah, if I'm not mistaken, the Lord said that Assyria was his staff. And undoubtedly, we know that the Assyrians came and ransacked the Jews, and ransacked the people of God, invaded them, besieged them. And it would interest you to know that the same sort of language is used in Jeremiah chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, with respect to an invading army besieging the people of God. Of course, predating 70 AD. But nevertheless, the Romans, when besieging Jerusalem, were used as the Lord's iron. I think it would interest you to know even further that the book of Daniel, when describing Rome, interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he attributes the fourth kingdom being of iron, as the kingdom of Rome. And it was during the time of Rome that the kingdom of the Messiah would be enacted, would be consummated. So, in closing, my point is this, is that by logical necessity, we are we are forced to conclude that the coming of the Son of Man has already occurred. And the coming of the Son of Man and the consummation of the eternal age and the last days, the final hour of the end of the Mosaic age, which, by the way, the reason why it was the end of the Mosaic age is because the Levitical priesthood, along with the temple worship, the altar, and all of those things, which were used to service the covenant, were destroyed. So that was the vanishing away of the old age, and had thereby ushered in the new. Now, I don't have time to go into the details and the implications of the eternal age, the messianic age, and all of the potential counter arguments that people would hurl my way in attempts to rebut this. As I've said already, this is merely scratching the surface, but suffice it to say, here in this segment, I wanted to emphatically declare and defend the idea, and what the scriptures in fact teach is that Jesus has already come. And this is also supported, as I've already proved, by history. So my final exhortation to us is that we have to be willing to be to discard the traditions of men. For the longest, I have believed differing eschatological views, the pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, amill, post-mill, pre-mill, every other mill except the scriptures, because of what man has taught. And so I think especially this is the case for those who hang on to the rapture view. We're not waiting to be raptured from responsibility. We need to take responsibility. The earth isn't going anywhere. It is here to remain, and the Lord expects for us to take dominion. And the coming of the Son of Man was the restoration of what was lost in Eden. And in Eden, before the fall of man, God wanted Adam to take dominion. So through the church, Christ rules. He mediates his rule through the ministerial priesthood and expects us as his people to rule in the midst of our enemies, according to Psalm 110. So God bless you. Give this a share. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. God bless.